Welcome back to my classroom again, everyone, and welcome back to this Coldfusion primer. In this chapter, we'll be mostly looking into theories, into how the CFML language is structured and how we can work with it, use it in some of our examples. I'll demonstrate those examples for you. First, we'll be looking at what is Coldfusion. Coldfusion was developed by Adobe. It runs on CFML language, and it is nothing more than an application server. CFML language is a Coldfusion markup language, and every file that we create or every script that we create will have to have an extension with .cfm. .cfm stands for Coldfusion markup. We can actually assume it to be a marriage between two markup languages. Although CFML is called markup, it can be referred to as a programming language. The marriage is actually between CFML and HTML, because the tags in CFML and the attributes in both the languages look similar. Their uses are in a similar fashion. We'll be looking more into it. We'll be looking into it when we look at some of the examples when I will demonstrate it to you. To understand how a CFML script works, we first need to understand how an HTML page works. We need to understand how the user's browser interacts with the server of the given website. Suppose we want to go to google.com. Here's the address. I'll be explaining this part also. First, we'll need to understand this part. The user's browser, or my browser suppose, sends the request to the server. This is really simple. In this example, the server receives the request and then it looks for the page that will match the request. It then retrieves the HTML page. It packs up all the data and sends the static HTML back to the user's server, which then downloads the page. This is the inside job that is happening inside the client's browser and the server side. We first need to understand what's happening inside the user's browser. This is the HTTP request. It contains the request line. It has several parts. I'll be explaining that. It has the header part. This entire section is the header part, and it's followed by a blank line with no body. It might contain a body, but I'm not showing a body in here. The first part, the request line, defines a method. There can be several kinds of method, but in this case we're using get. Then the slash indicates that the request should be looking for the resource in the domain's root directory. The HTTP version is version 1.1. Your browser can also use version 1.0, but my browser is using 1.1. Then the host is being requested as www.google.com, and the user agent, or the browser version and the Windows version, or in Mac the Mac's version, and the connection is set to keep alive. The connection must be continuous. This is meant by kept alive. After the request is being sent, the server on the other hand sees it, and after it retrieves the HTML page, it says, okay man, I've got the page, so status code 200, which means okay. And I will also send back this response in HTTP version 1.1. So let's print a date. This is the date, and the content type of my resource is a static HTML page. Now here we can also see a blank line. This is a convention. This must be followed. After the header we need to have a blank line. Now the server sees that it has the resource, and it prints the body in its response text and sends the response text to the user's browser, which will then be downloaded by the browser for the user to view it. Let's look into the structure of the HTTP response. HTTP response is quite similar to HTTP request. The only difference is the status line in here, which is actually dependent on this code. If it was 404, which means page not found, then the server would not print this body to the text and return it as the response. But as we can see, we have found or our server has found the page and the resource, it will print that resource in its body or the response body in here and send back that text to the browser. We must remember that the browser can only understand HTML. It does not understand any other programming language. So whatever programming language we are using, even if it's CFML, we need to render the output as an HTML page. So now let's look at how the server, the user, interacts with the Coldfusion server. In this picture we have another member called Coldfusion. The CFML way of interaction is quite similar to the HTML way of interaction, but it has its own difference. Let's look at the reference for now. For example, the user requests google.com from his own browser, and the server in here, acting as an intermediary, receives the request, and request is sent or redirected to the Coldfusion server. The Coldfusion server receives the request and matches that request with its own files. If it finds the file, it then processes all the Coldfusion codes. It then generates the dynamic HTML page and sends it back to the server. The server has a job in here to do. This guy's server, he takes the dynamic HTML page and generates a static HTML which the browser will be able to understand, because our browsers today can only understand HTML. It generates the static HTML page from the dynamic HTML page which the Coldfusion server has produced, sends back the HTML page to the browser. This is quite simple, you know. The only thing that is happening is the generation of dynamic page to the static page. Before we saw that there were only two-way interaction in here. The user is requesting a static page, the browser is sending a static page. But now we are seeing that the user, like before, is requesting a static page, but the server is redirecting it to the dynamic or the Coldfusion server, and it's generating a dynamic page and sending back the static page. There is one more thing that I need you to remember before I go any further, because the examples I will be showing you will need to use this .cfm file extension. You must not use .html extension, because if we are using the .html extension, the page won't go through this Coldfusion server. So you need to remember. Now let's dive into the language basics. First, we'll be moving into variables and comments. So let's look at some variable rules right now. Variables can have four types. First, they can have string, they can have numeric, they can have boolean, or they can have date or time. We need to remember that variables can't have spaces. If you need to use a space, then use the underscore. They are not case sensitive, unlike strings, which are in this case, in Coldfusion's case, they are case sensitive. When using a string, you can actually use a single or a double quotation marks, like this. This is a string. In numeric classes, there are two types. First, the integer type. This actually has a really long range. Then the second type is the decimal type. We don't actually need to use any quotation marks when we are setting a numeric value. To set a variable, we need to use this cf set tag. We can also set a variable in this cf script pair tag. To set a variable in cf script, we first need to start with the cf script, the variable name, assign a value to it, and then end this CF script. This is much more easier because we also need to do or use some of our functions or write some of our functions in the same thing.